This is Chthoniya, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthoniya, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we are going to go back to the folklore, in this case the folklore of Wales, and talk about the Bendith Y Mamau. Now, Bendith Y Mamau actually represents a group of beings, not a singular being. And the reason my attention was drawn to these particular group of fairies, is what they are, is that they had been mentioned as there are tales about them being quote unquote very fair looking, fair folk or fair fairies, particularly feminine ones. And by fair I mean blonde. And that the idea they were child stealers. Okay, so they were so these were a type of fairy, and one of their most noteworthy attributes was that they went and stole human children. Now, the more I researched the Bendith Y Mamau and looked at compared it to other aspects of fairy lore, or comparing it to other stories, the more that I'm realizing that it's not something that's necessarily unique to Welsh fairy lore. The idea of child stealing you see throughout all of Europe fairy lore. You see it in, not only in the Welsh, you see it in Cornish fairy lore, you see it in English fairy lore, you see it in Scottish fairy lore, Irish fairy lore, and then throughout the continent. And so it's not necessarily unique, and probably has its origins in Greece, as we're going to discuss in a moment. And of course, as I'm coming to discover that the Bendith Y Mamau are not, first of all, they're not necessarily fair in appearance. They're considered to be hybrids or interbreeding between fairies and goblins. So yeah, that does not imply creatures that are particularly attractive, although I have read in certain places that one of the chief differences between Welsh folklore and, say, English folklore is that English fairies tend to be, these kind of very hideous-looking, monstrous creatures, whereas Welsh fairies tend to be more human-looking and more attractive. But clearly, from discussing this, that doesn't appear to be quite true. So what I want to do, but nonetheless, I'm pursuing this track for a reason, because I think it's worth talking a little bit about the way that these beings are in Welsh fairy lore, and also the Welsh underworld, which is called Annwn, and the way in which this idea of the changeling story, which we've not really dealt with in this podcast, and that is certainly another aspect of what we might think of the dark feminine, because it is centered around the idea of mothers and babies and the loss of children, or the way in which one deals with children who are quote unquote different in some fashion. So I've decided to go down this track because I think it still might be useful. Okay, so let's get back to the subject. First, let's talk about the Bendith Y Mamau. What does the word mean? It means, it basically translates to the blessing of the mothers, or the mother's blessing. Okay, and the way they are described here is a unpleasant clan of Welsh fairies, part of what they call the Unseelie Court of Carmarthenshire. So I think I've heard Glamorganshire and Carmarthenshire seem to be the particular place where this phrase Bendith Y Mamau is used, and they say it's sometimes used almost as a prayer, because it's saying, oh, you're the mother's blessing, like, oh, you're just all so wonderful now, of course you're going to leave me alone, and they do belong to they're said to be either synonymous with, or at least part of a group known as the Tylwyth Teg, which is the fair family, which seems to be the Welsh term for the fairies in general. And Bendith Y Mamau is often a term used for fairies in general, but again, just like the Furies are called the Eumenides or kindly ones, so thus the Tylwyth Teg are called the Bendith Y Mamau, the mother's blessing, And and again, as I've said, in certain sources they're described as being fair or fair-haired. However, here they're described as being identified with either brownies or pixies. Although, again, I don't know that their attributes specifically. Brownies and pixies tend to be very helpful but mischievous spirits. And I'm not sure that the Bendith Y Mamau are always considered to be quite that way. I think there are some stories that portray them in a more favorable light. But, generally they're considered to be somewhat destructive. The term unseelie comes from Scottish folklore and has to do with a brand of fairy that's very unpleasant and not really particularly nice to humans. In fact, they tend to be either destructive or cannibalistic or devouring in some way. And while I don't think that's actually said to be true of any of these types of fairies, this is, I haven't seen any stories that talks about any of them eating children or anything like that. Definitely child abduction is a theme here. And it says here on their behavior, and it mentions their interbreeding between goblins and fairies. So, again, we're not really talking about, to call them fair, meaning attractive, is more of a euphemism. It says, mothers had to take precautions not to leave their babies unattended in fairy country, as the Bendith were particularly ready to steal small children and replace them with their own changelings known as crimbles. The Bendith envy beauty and are sometimes consumed by jealousy, but they generally treat their captives well. They would raise the child, teaching it music and song in an extended reverie, only returning the child much later with only faint memories of sweet music. It was thought that they needed to improve their stock with mortal blood. The Bendith are also known to be astoundingly brilliant musicians and singers. And then, of course, there's some discussion of how one retrieves mortal children, which we'll talk about in a minute. So you have this idea of the sweet music or the music of the fairies, which we know is supposed to be, very magical and very beautiful, but also, like the Song of the Siren has the quality of being able to lead one astray. So it's that music of nature. It's the music of the wildness. And indeed, this particular group is connected with the idea of the wild hunt, which you not only see in Wales, but you also see it in folklore in, Britain and Ireland and other places. Better not say that. England, Ireland, and other places where we have this idea of the wild hunt. It is not something exclusive to the to Wales or to Welsh fairy lore, but this does seem to be a specific characteristic of the Bendith Y Mamau. Okay, so what else do we say about them? Well, first of all, there's Jones's Celtic Encyclopedia, which is looks like Mary Jones from the year 2004. It's copyrighted. She again describes them as the term as referring to the blessing of the mothers, and she says this is a Welsh term for a type of fairy, possibly synonymous with the Tylwyth Teg. Their name, otherwise obscure, may be a relic of the worship of the Matrone, the triple mothers, much as Modron is derived from Matrona, the singular form and goddess of the Marne. Okay, so Matrone is again that's a Latin word, and that refers to three mothers. So we're getting back to Roman sources here, and so the idea of triple mothers, the triple figures that we see in Greek and Roman mythology tend to refer back to the goddess Hecate in particular. Okay, and Hecate, of course. Her, not only crossroads or liminal spaces are her area, but also the underworld. So we see this connection here. So again, you have this kind of mixture of ideas here about this, this underworld kind of association. And again, the idea of Bendith Y Mamau was commonly used in Glamorganshire as well as Carmarthenshire. So this seems to be a term relevant to a specific portion of Wales. And she also mentions here that the Cwn Annwn, or hellhounds, were alternately called Cwn Bendith Y Mamau, or just the Cwn Y Mamau. It's so there's an association between this particular group of fae or fairies and hellhounds. So that leads us to the idea of Annwn, which is the Celtic, not Celtic, I shouldn't say, it's the Welsh underworld. And the Welsh underworld is the is a place that, again, depending on what sources you read, certainly in later medieval sources, certainly Christian sources, it's referred to as a torturous hell. However, the way that it's conceived of in the book of Taliesin, and also in the other aspects of Arthurian legend, it's described as a world of delights and eternal youth, where disease was absent and food was ever abundant. And then in some versions, it becomes identified with the Christian afterlife in paradise or heaven. But then there are others that refer to it as hell. The ruler of the underworld is either known as Aron or Gwynep Neith, who is, in Gwynep Neith also sometimes is considered to be the leader of the Wild Hunt. So there's this connection between the otherworld and the underworld. It's just as we see the connection of the Wild Hunt with Samhain, the holiday that is equated with Halloween. You see this Wild Hunt coming about, first of all, to see the Wild Hunt in action is considered to be an omen of death, because you're basically seeing all these beings from the other world. But you are also seeing, and of course, when the veil between those worlds is thin, then this is where you can see this kind of activity. And the Wild Hunt, I mean, I'm not going to go off on the tangent of the Wild Hunt, but it's a motif that has existed in of this idea of this wild spectral hunting pack that appears, and clearly they are coming from the other world. And of course, obviously, particularly in Christian times, and maybe in others as well, to see kind of those kinds of spectral things was considered to be a very ill omen. Now, Annwn is supposedly, this is Middle Welsh sources suggest it was recognized as meaning the term very deep. So there, again, the implication of something that's underground. The appearance of a form, atumnos, on an ancient Gaulish curse tablet, which means other, on other and tumnos, world, suggests that the original term may have been andedubnos, a common Gallo-Brittonic word that literally meant underworld. Okay. So it's, so clearly, so the fact that we see this Gaulish connection is, so we see the origins of the word among other Celtic sources. Although the idea, may also be, I'm just looking at the form of it, the fact that it appears on the curse tablets and so forth, that curse tablets are something that we see particularly in ancient Greece around, 2nd, 3rd century BCE in particular. So, there's this, so we're going to talk in a moment about these kind of Greek origins of these particular concepts. So again, we have this other world, and in a lot of ways, it resembles the world of the Tuatha De Danann in Irish mythology. It's not, I don't want to, it's not necessarily exactly the same in every aspect, but we do have this, certainly the interpretation of it is similar. The Tir na Nog, which is the other world in Irish myth and folklore, is described as very similarly as this very beautiful place of abundance. This land, and this of course is the land where the fairies also live, which is why the fairies are often conflated with the dead. But it's clearly a world of beings that are in many ways different. They may look human, but are different. And I think of the mythology of the Morrigan's Cave, or Owen-Agat, which is in Ireland. It's in near Rathcrohan in County Roscommon. And Owen-Agat is known as the Cave of the Cats, and there's a whole legend about Queen Maeve and how she chooses the bravest of 3 warriors, and there's this cat, of course, is more like a Black Panther, scary, like monstrous cat that comes out of the underworld and challenges these particular heroes. So there's a story about that. This is also the cave, though, where the Morrigan is said to come out on her chestnut-colored horse that only has 1 leg, and she often comes out at Samhain. So, but it's interesting because if you go to Rathcrohan and you find they have the the placard that tells you, this site is known as, and so they have the name and then they have the explanation. And Owenagit is referred to now on there as the gate to hell. But yet, this underworld is supposed to be a beautiful and delightful place that's an equivalent to a paradise. So again, there's just the outright demonizing of these places, these other worlds that were part of earlier religious beliefs. So you have this idea of an other world that is different or that is foreign, but now we're conveying the idea that what's different or foreign is somehow bad. Now that will lead us into the next part of what we're talking about here, and that is the idea of the changeling. Now, first, I want to talk. I have Diane Purkis's work, at the bottom of the garden, which is about fairy lore. And I wanted to read a little bit from her chapter on ancient worlds, because this was a chapter on child-stealing demons, particularly Lamia and Mormo and Gello, Lamashtu, Lilith. They're all considered to be these, at least some of their attributes are center around child stealing. And so she has a section here called Ancient Fairies, where she talks about talks about these particular figures and relates them to the child-stealing fairies of later folklore. So let me just read to you a little bit from what she says. I'm not going to read the entire section, but just the relevant ones. So first she says, what have we learned about fairies if both child-killing demons and nymphs are fairies? Because she also talks about water nymphs. And she says many things. Fairies come from outside the community, civilization, even when they seem to share its values. Fairies were either once people or are like people who have become trapped at certain indeterminate phase of life. Fairies have links with the dead, and some are the dead. Young men, women in childbirth, and babies and children are particularly vulnerable to fairies. Fairies are compelled to repeat their own circumstances in the lives of others. If they die prematurely, they cause the premature deaths of others. If they're trapped in eternal, storyless youth, they try to trap others in it too. Fairies have bodies which reflect their anomalousness, subtly or directly. So yeah, there's something about them that's going to tip you off that you're not really dealing with someone human. Fairies are also particularized to the local situation, as the changing role of nymphs has indicated. Fairies are common to peasant cultures where the center of life is the village and the space around it. And she says, all this time I've been sedulously ignoring a vital question. Why on earth are these beings fairies? Everyone knows, or at least everyone thinks they know, that fairies are Celtic. And here I am insisting that fairies' origins lie in the ancient cultures of the Mediterranean. Yet the more stories about ancient demons that I read, the more I was struck by their extraordinary similarity to medieval early modern fairies. And so she says that basically later on, once she talks about Northern European fairies, that the parallels will be much more obvious. So she gets to that. And then she said then she talks about the explanations for why these recur in culture, the one being universal cultural archetypes, which I think that theory has some merit. She really isn't convinced by it, but, which is okay. Then she talks about common structures. Society with similar social structures may have similar narratives. And then direct transmission. Celts learn these stories directly from their contacts in the Mediterranean. And she's actually very much fond, while a lot of anthropologists like the second one, she is actually fond of the third one in particular, and she explains why. She says so she's talking, in talking about that second discussion of similar social structures lead to similar stories, she says, what we can see at such moments is not the birth of entirely new stories, but the ceaseless reshaping of old stories to fit new contexts. Sometimes this involves simple changes of geography, sometimes changes in point of view, sometimes more drastic changes in narrative. But in every case, the result is a blend of continuity and change. We have asked about change. We need to ask about continuity now and the plausibility of the third explanation. What if fairies, contrary to every common assumption, actually originated in the ancient world of the Mediterranean and not the Celtic darkness of Northern Europe? Is it possible? And she says the answer is yes. She says the Celts had a lot more early contact with Greeks than most people imagine, encountering them regularly as foes and trading partners from the 6th century BCE onward. During the period of the Roman Empire, Greek ideas and culture were diffused in Romanized forms throughout the Celtic world. The Celts picked up and Celticized large slices of Roman religion, political culture, and military know-how. Before and through the empire, Celts were in constant contact with Greek culture for hundreds of years. To assume that they kept to their own folkways without any outside influences during this period is like assuming that no one in modern Britain is at all influenced by French culture today, despite the frequency of cross-channel ferry sailings. Another reason for the idea that ferries drift on the wings of empire from the Mediterranean to the Celtic regions is that attempts to explain the origin of fairy beliefs with reference to Celtic culture have only failed. No one now believes that the fairies are dethroned Celtic gods or memories of vanishing ancient Britons. If they cannot be explained through Celtic culture alone, then it seems at least worth trying to explain them as a product of the cosmopolitanism of empire rather than the parochialism of Northern Europe. Okay. So what she is saying is that just as we see that syncretism occurring within the Roman Empire, where they assimilate Greek belief, where they've assimilated Etruscan beliefs, and then, of course, after the Punic Wars, they're picking up, in Greece, certainly much earlier than that, but certainly in Rome, after the Punic Wars, you see things like Mithraism appearing in the Roman Empire, or Kybele worship, or these other things. And then, of course, when they make forays into Egypt, you see that come in as well. So, nonetheless, what developed as religion in the Roman Empire ends up certainly being filtered throughout, and probably earlier forms as well, because ancient Greece, like I said, if they've been trading with ancient Greece since the 6th century, certainly there's a whole host of mythology, culture, and folk belief that comes out of that region that gets shared as well. So, so there's a whole admixture there that's probably be very, very difficult to sort out and say, oh, this specifically comes from here and this specifically comes from here. So we have this idea. So she's talking about these child-stealing demons and fairies. That is one of the characteristics, not just in Welsh mythology, but in all the mythologies, that they are, one of the things that fairies do is steal children. And there's this idea of the changeling. So I want to talk about the idea of the changeling. I think the one thing I didn't mention here, I just want to finish this up before I move on, is the idea of the hounds of Annwn, or the Cwn Annwn. And it said they were associated with a form of the wild hunt presided over by the king of the underworld. In Wales, they're associated with migrating geese, supposedly because their honking in the night is reminiscent of barking dogs. And, and of course, there is a connection between that and the howling dogs that foretold death. So we think of, say, Black Shuck in Cambridgeshire in England, or, other versions of the hellhound or the black dog that are seen in Yorkshire and also in the West Country in England and in different places. There's, there's some version of this black dog that appears throughout the folklore in those regions. So it's interesting that the Bendith Y Mamau are connected to them. So it says that they have they're supposed to hunt on specific nights: the Eve of St. John, St. Martin, St. Michael, All Saints, Christmas, New Year, St. Agnes, St. David, and Good Friday. Or in some cases, just in autumn and winter. Some say they only hunt from Christmas to Twelfth Night. The Cwn Annwn came to be regarded as the escorted souls on their journey to the other world. So again, that may be why the Bendith Y Mamau are associated with them, because they are said to be these creatures of the other world, or that bring others to the other world. The goal of a hellhound in the wild hunt is to hunt wrongdoers into the ground so they can run no longer, just as criminals did to their victims. The hellhound is associated with death and has red ears. The Celts associated color red with death. Well, white is associated with the supernatural, and white animals are commonly owned by gods or other inhabitants of the otherworld. Therefore, the Cwn Annwn is associated with death and the supernatural. And the red and white colors, also in certain tales of the Morrigan, you also see, and again, she's not part of Welsh mythology, but she's also referred to as having red and white. So it's very clear that red and white are these colors in this region that are associated with the other world. Okay, so just wanted to mention that reference. So it's interesting how they're said to take on these kind of form of dogs. But we've seen this in other cultures as well, where you may have these kinds of either psychopomp spirits or just spirits that have to do with liminality or the realm of death that take the form of a dog or a black dog. Okay, so let's move on to the idea of the, to the changeling aspect of this. So the idea of a changeling is that you have the fairies. What's been said, and I'm going to look at Wilt Sykes here and his work on Welsh mythology. It's actually called British goblins, which will deeply offend some people. But Welsh folklore, fairy mythology, legends, and traditions. So yeah, there's this habit of using the term British when British is not what is actually meant. Certainly, a lot of Welsh people would probably take offense at that, but but nonetheless, that was the title of the work. So for better or for worse, that's the title of the work. But it is about Welsh folklore and is considered to be one of the better sources from the earlier 20th century on the subject. So so I'm just going to read this from Sykes' work. He says, the Tylwyth Teg have a fatal admiration for lovely children, hence the abundant folklore concerning infants who have been stolen from the cradle, and what he calls a Plentynwyd, or a change child, the equivalent of a changeling, is left in its place by the Tylwyth Teg. It has the exact appearance of the stolen infant at first, but its aspect speedily alters. It grows ugly of face, shriveled of form, ill-tempered, wailing, and generally frightful. It bites and strikes, becomes a terror to the poor mother. Sometimes it is, idiotic, as is the term he uses, but again has a supernatural cunning, not only impossible in a mortal babe, but not even appertaining to the oldest heads on other than fairy shoulders. Okay. So in other words, its head starts to clearly not look very human. The veracious prophet Jones testifies to a case where he himself saw the Plentynwyd, an idiot left in the stead of a son of Edmund John William of the Church Valley, Monmouthshire. Says Jones, I saw him myself. There was something diabolical in his aspect, but especially in his motions. He made very disagreeable screaming sounds, which used to frighten strangers greatly, but otherwise he was harmless. He was of a dark, tawny complexion. He lived longer than such children usually lived in Wales in that day, a not altogether pleasant intimation regarding the hard lot which such children were subjected by their unwilling parents, reaching the age of 10 or 12 years. But the creed of ignorance everywhere as regards changelings is a very cruel one, and reminds us of the test of the witchcraft trials. Under the pretense of proving whether the objectionable baby is a changeling or not, it is held on a shovel over the fire, or it is bathed in a solution of the foxglove, which kills it. A case where this test was applied is said to have actually occurred in Carnarvonshire in 1857. That there is nothing specially Welsh about this needs not be pointed out. Apart from the fact that infanticide, like murder, is of no country, similar practices as to changelings have prevailed in most European lands, either to test the child's uncanny quality, or that being admitted to drive it away and thus compel the fairies to restore the missing infant. In Denmark, the mother heats the oven and places the changeling on the peel, pretending to put it in, or whips it severely with a rod, or throws it into the water. In Sweden, they employ similar methods. In Ireland, the hot shovel is used. With regard to a changeling, which Martin Luther tells of in his Colloquia Mensalia, the great reformer declared to the Prince of Anhalt that if he were prince of that country, he would venture homicidum therein and would throw it into the river Moldau. So in other words, Martin Luther is saying he should take a child and drown it. He admonished the people to pray devoutly to God to take away the devil, which was done accordingly in the second year after the changeling died. It is hardly probable that the child was well fed during the 2 years this pious process was going on. Its starved ravenous appetite, indeed, is indicated in Luther's description. It would eat as much as 2 threshers, would laugh and be joyful when any evil has happened in the house, but would cry and be sad when all went well. And there's another story told in Wales about, he says, preserves a tradition of an exceedingly frugal meal which was employed as a means of banishing a Plentynwyd. And this Monsieur Villemarquet, when in Glamorganshire, heard this story, which he found to be precisely the same as a Breton legend, which the changeling utters a rhymed triad as follows. Now, he has the triad. I'm not going to try to repeat it, but we'll see a little bit of what the translation is as we go on. In the Glamorgan story, the changeling was heard muttering to himself in a cracked voice, I have seen the acorn before I saw the oak. I have seen the egg before I saw the white hen. I have never seen the like of this. And that's actually what's being said in Welsh here. And Monsieur Villemarquet found it remarkable that these words form in Welsh a rhyme triad nearly the same as that in the Breton ballad. Okay, so they repeat this again. Whence he concluded that the story and the rhyme were older than the 7th century, the epoch of the separation of the Britons of Wales and Armorica. And this is the story. A mother whose child had been stolen, a changeling left in its place, was advised by the Virgin Mary to prepare a meal for 10 farm servants and an eggshell, which would make the changeling speak. This she did, and the changeling asked what she was about. She told him, whereupon he exclaimed, "A meal for 10, dear mother, in one eggshell?" Then he uttered the exclamation that we just said above, and the mother replied, "You have seen too many things, my son, you shall have a beating." With this she fell to beating him, the child fell to bawling, and the fairy came and took him away, leaving the stolen child sleeping sweetly in the cradle. It awoke and said, "Ah, mother, I have been a long time asleep." Okay. So this is Sykes's version of a Welsh tale. And as we can see, changelings, and he very accurately notes the connection between that and witch trials and the way in which witches were tested. And in both cases, the whole idea was the idea that one either made a pact with the devil or came from the other world, although usually these things were considered interchangeable. Fairies were not necessarily said to come from hell, but once you see the other world as the version of hell, and as you can see, it's not clear in some cases whether the other world's viewed as heaven or hell, then then there becomes this justification of quote unquote driving out the evil. And the sad part about this is that what's really happening here is oftentimes these are children who are suffering from some kind of disease. It could be a physical disease. It could be a physical disease that creates a deformity or a look that they don't consider to be particularly attractive. It could also have to do with a mental thing. A lot of times children with encephalitis, with the swelling of the brain, were treated in this way. And these are actually children who are suffering from something where there needs to be compassion and extra care, and not throwing them in a fire and throwing them outside. But this is the unfortunate thing when we start to associate a certain look. And you notice that he is considered the child that is referred to in the Sykes story there is of a darker skin. So you've got a darker skinned child, and you've also got one that doesn't behave well, or in some way, in other cases, just has a look that the parents don't find repellent in some way. So therefore, that which we don't consider part of our aesthetic, or that who aren't white like us, in some fashion, even though there's quite a bit of there's many darker olive skinned people in throughout Ireland, Wales, England, as there are white skinned people. It's not necessarily true that everybody is everybody's white, or just like not everybody from Ireland is freckle faced with red with ginger hair. It's not you can't stereotype that way. But if there's this what they might call the swarthier appearance is what they used to call it, that people tend to judge that as an evil, and that feel like that makes them justified in doing harm to the child. There's a article here called "Fairies and the Folklore of Disability: Changelings, Hybrid, and the Solitary Fairy." So this author talks about how the different ways, different reasons why children might be who are different in some fashion. There was different explanations for it. So she says, in the case of congenital disorders, the human mind reacted by formulating two primarily and often overlapping theories of causation. The first focuses on thoughts conscious and unconscious of the mother. Maternal impressions and responses were held to produce certain clearly identifiable psychogenic effects upon the child. So, for example, a pregnant woman who was impressed or frightened by gibbons at the zoo might give birth to a quote-unquote monkey-headed or encephalitic child. A variation of this theory involved the breaking of a taboo by the mother, such as the woman who refused food to a needy neighbor who came begging. 6 months later, this woman bore a child who had no mouth. Okay, so they're thinking that somehow the psychological guilt affects the shape of the child. So she said, so this says, if the child's defect is viewed as the result of divine or supernatural vengeance delivered to rebuke the mother's stinginess, then we have entered the realm of the second group of theories about the causation of congenital disorders, those which held these disorders to be produced by supernatural intervention in one form or another. In this case, apparent sins, such as that of an ungenerous woman, might result in divine chastisement in the form of a sick or malformed child. However, it's rare in the literature of a changeling. Perhaps this rationale became more common with the growing influence of the Christian Church. As Chamberlain writes in Old Wives' Tales, under Christianity, sickness now became evidence of the power and justice of a beneficent God. Sickness was the result of sin, and a healing a matter of forgiveness. So it says, of course, supernatural intervention could occur in a most obvious and active form, child napping, with the changeling left to take the place of the child stolen by the fairies. Some of these changed children were active, if unattractive, little beings. Others were stocks, inanimate wooden doll-like beings which soon lost all semblance of life. And then there's the idea of hybridity, which is where a human being would have sexual relations with non-human beings, which produced offspring. Gods, devils, incubi, succubi, fairies, and so forth were the human partners. And it says often the supernatural parent would stake some claim over the child, in the case of the Silky, who returned to an earthly Norris to reclaim his son. The children of these unions traditionally bore a special sign to their unusual parentage, webbed fingers or scaly skin, for example. And then the more mundane pairing of humans with animals, although the animals in question had supernatural associations. According to folk belief, children born to these pairings were marked in some way also. A child born with a cleft lip might be viewed as the result of a human coupling with a cat or a hare. The fact that both have been identified as witches' familiars may have some relationship to the frequency with which those disorders occur. When the Christian Church began to interpret the birth of offspring with congenital disorders as a sign of supernatural and demonic intervention, both men and women had reason to fear for their lives if they parented or in the vicinity of the birth of atypical newborns, animal or human. In Puritan New England in 1642, a young hired man was convicted of consorting with the devil and was executed when one of the sows bore a psychoplic or one-eyed piglet. In Denmark, as late as 1683, a young mother was burned at the stake for giving birth to a monkey-headed child who was, in all probability, encephalitic, born with an incomplete brain and a malformed skull. When a child survived infancy with severe mental or physical defect, it might also be viewed as evil. Martin Luther labeled one severely challenged child as no more than a massa carnis, a soulless mass of flesh, and went as far as to recommend that the child be disposed of by drowning. In the lore of the changeling, however, the inhuman or demonic nature of the child did not bring forth a uniformly negative response, although some of the techniques used to reveal the true nature were at least as inhumane as Luther's suggested solution. Okay, so we see here this idea. I think what the bottom line here is that we're trying to get to is that when we start talking about these figures and these child stealers, because they're also talking about the way in which hermaphroditic children, dual-sexed children, others were disposed of in Rome, or that children with these kind of imperfections were held to be human sacrifices, because they were, and then in other views, they were the idea that this child was born as a scapegoat, that God gave you this child as a scapegoat for all the sins, and could therefore be abused forthwith because they were, because they were representations of the sin of the community. And knowing what we know nowadays about not only physical, those kinds of physical disorders, but also of mental, different mental situations and psychological things that people suffer from. There was an article recently about the way in which people were trying to refer to autistic children as being quote unquote changelings, and there's a lot that's wrong with that. I probably don't even need to tell you. Trying to treat anybody who has that kind of a difference as somehow being, what this amounts to is a kind of othering, and the way in which we, as my thesis has always been, the way in which we fear the other and the way that we demonize the other. And we put it in these forms. And so obviously there's this idea of these otherworldly creatures, these otherworldly fairy mothers who don't like their children and leave them for you to take your actual perfect child. So it becomes, so those kind of imperfections become justified by, well, sometimes it's the parents consorting with quote unquote the devil, or it's just this idea that that somehow these sinister, malicious fairy folk come in and get rid of their own children and take yours. And it's pretty sad, because this is, because obviously the child already is facing a certain number of challenges, now has the additional challenge. There's always the challenge that we're all facing in life, regardless of situation, of trying to quote unquote fit in. I've talked about the theme of separation, but this is actually a way of taking children who face those kind of challenges and putting them into this category of something, we don't like the way it looks, we don't like the way it acts, therefore it's evil and demonic and must be gotten rid of. And probably just pointing out those examples in a nutshell should tell you everything that's wrong with it without me having to go on my soapbox about it. But it certainly does drive home the point of at least one of many reasons why we need to really be careful about othering, people, and that, or certain behaviors or certain attributes that we somehow think are different or foreign from us. I mean, it's not that we should not, with certain types of human behaviors, not set boundaries that are appropriate, but there's a lot of times, the tendency is to be afraid of and to demonize those things which we don't understand. And I don't think it's any more obvious than you see in a place like this. And of course, again, the more you get into a good versus evil, moral, religious stance, and a people that, believe the idea of, witches as agents of the devil causing destruction, or these, or consorting with fairies or consorting with the devil, and the suspicious of the feminine in general is somehow, trying to bring some kind of an ill. And of course, because the woman's the one who gives birth, it's obviously all her fault, right? But, the way in which these were, these children were often seen and treated, tells you a lot about what's wrong with good versus evil culture. That's all I'm going to say on this subject. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to check out all my work, please visit cathonia.net. I do a regular overhaul and update of the site somewhat regularly. And if you want to follow the latest updates on podcasts and other work, please visit me on social media. I had a blip there in my thinking. In either Facebook, it's Cathonia Podcast, 2 words. On Twitter and Instagram, it's Cathonia Podcast, 1 word, and just Cathonia on YouTube. If you would like to follow my work or to support it, please visit patreon.com/Cathonia. And I want to thank all of those of you who have been my patrons all this time, and thank all of you for listening, and until the next episode.